All right, cool. So, welcome everyone. We're going through everything you need to know about accessory work training today. So, if you have any questions at all, we've got a small enough group today where you can just unmute yourself, cut me off, and we'll go through questions as we go. Goal with today is pretty simple, right? So today we're going to be talking about some foundations, things you should be knowing and incorporating into your accessory work training programs to make sure that you're getting the most out of them, making sure you're setting yourself up for success in your powerlifting program. Because at the end of the day, you can have the best or the worst accessory program, but if it doesn't translate to pounds on the platform in the big three, it doesn't really matter that much within the context of powerlifting. So without further ado, let's jump in here. So there's a really large amount of progress that I'll see that gets missed in the squat, bench, and the deadlift, just by way of lifters lacking some of the benefits they'll see from accessory work, or that some of the benefits that can be gained from accessory work. So specifically looking at basically gaining muscular balance, so avoiding imbalances from developing, from really training and pushing for progression with the big three, as well as looking for, just general overall muscularity. So building a bigger engine is going to give you a faster car. So the big reasons why we'd want to use accessory movements are, as opposed to just using the main lifts to do everything, right, are that most of the times the rep ranges and the variations we're going to use on accessory movements, and by accessory I mean anything that's not a sort of main barbell lift or secondary movement. Something like a pause squat would be to a squat, that'd be secondary. Something like an accessory work would be more lunges and leg presses, where you're not squatting with a barbell per se. So the reason that accessories tend to accumulate less stress, and in turn we can train them with higher volumes without digging ourselves as deep of a hole as we would get with the main variant. So if we wanted bigger legs, we can't just say do more squats, because there will be a point where systemically you'll get too much fatigue, and there's some value in that, but we want to make sure that we're getting enough volume in and managing fatigue well enough that we're still able to progress in strength. So because of how accessory works, accessory exercises are made, and just inherently how they are by nature, they tend to use lighter loads, and they're going to be a little bit less fatiguing as a result, so you can generally get more training. And within the context of a powerlifting program, the accessory work isn't necessarily designed to where you're trying to get the absolute strongest barbell row 1 rep max. And so as a result, it tends not to be as much of a focus in the program. You can use more variation because of the context that we talked about earlier, building against muscular imbalance, and then just generally working on hypertrophy, which we can approach with a much more general scope than trying to train the powerlifts, where you have to get a higher 1 rep max in a squat on your back, like a back squat, a barbell bench press, and a barbell deadlift from the floor, right? So with all that said, when we're selecting accessory work, we want to think about trying to strike that balance between creating the most benefit and getting the most carryover into the lifts, right, while making sure that we're not basically fatiguing you too much to where it's going to detract from your performance and recovery in your main program. So we really want to look at how can our accessory work program support the main program with the big three and not work against us. So as such, we need to really look at training economy and selecting movements where we can be very focused, as opposed to trying to do every accessory exercise under the sun and just trying to cover all your bases. And we'll talk about periodizing accessory movements a little bit later today. So one quick thing that I will note here is, if you're not sure how to build out an accessory program, today we're going to be talking fairly high level. If you wanted to get into some more specifics and see some case studies and example programs on how to build out an accessory program, I'd invite you to comment ebook below, and I'll get you a copy of my definitive powerlifting accessory manual. So it's a fully comprehensive ebook, walks you through everything you need to know about building an accessory work program in a fairly granular level of detail, a little bit more detail than we'll go into today. So if you're interested in that, post it up in the chat or in the comments below, just say ebook, I'll get that sent over. So with everything we talked about a moment ago in terms of incorporating accessory movements, them being beneficial because they're a little bit less fatiguing overall when we're trying to work on improving muscularity, right? And it's going to allow us to have a bit more variation. We want to consider why even bother with variation in the first place, right? So I think it's going to boil down to two things for most lifters. One is that when we're looking at doing accessory lifts for muscle gain, right, like I mentioned earlier, you're going to tend to run up against a bit of a wall where a barbell back squat is a good leg and back builder. But there will be a point where, especially if you're squatting low bar, your back will just start to give out and it will fatigue to the point where you can't get any more productive reps in at whatever weight. And so you need to deload a lot. And now the stimulus on your legs starts to become lower, right? And that's kind of on the best side of the spectrum. On the worst side of the spectrum, your back starts to fatigue, you start to accumulate a lot of fatigue, and we see some technical breakdown to where you might be risking injury. So in a more volume-based phase where we're trying to gain more muscle, it would be really beneficial to have some ways to really target the legs while minimizing the injury risk we would see with increased amounts of fatigue, right? It's not that the injury risk goes away, but we can mitigate it by giving you perhaps some more stable variations like a leg press, or some lunges, things that aren't going to load the spine quite as much, assuming that we're trying to develop the legs, and they're our main limiting point that we're trying to build up, right? The second reason we want to use variation is for the longevity side of things, right? So training for any sport is inherently an unhealthy activity in the sense that it's not balanced, right? In order to really get to a high level of performance in powerlifting, you need to apply a high degree of specificity, meaning you need to really, really focus on developing certain traits in the movements that you're training. So your squat, your bench press, and your deadlift 1 rep max. And as a result of that, that's going to bias your training towards that. And you'll tend to miss out on some other aspects that are going to keep you healthy long term. You'll tend to develop stronger quads, especially distally in your knees. Your hamstrings will be strong as perhaps hip extensors, but maybe not so much as knee flexors, because there's not as much knee flexion in powerlifting, at least in a concentric or loaded sense, right? And typically we'll see people tend towards a very extended and internally rotated at the shoulders position, where if you think hockey butt, that's what we'll see. And a pretty anterior pelvic tilt will develop because the lifts favor that, right? And that's fine. We need that for a good performance in power lifts. But if that starts getting you to where you start pushing a little bit more towards constantly tweaking out your erectors or your knees or your bicep tendons, well, we probably want to do a little bit of work to start to kind of bring you back from that extreme end of the spectrum enough to where you can still perform here, but you have the off switch and you've got some other options for movement where they're going to help provide you with some movement variability and hopefully help with reducing injury risk as well. So there are typically some weak points that I see commonly develop in powerlifters just by way of not having a ton of unilateral or one-legged or one-arm exercise. They'll tend to lose a lot of side-to-side and rotational control. So movements like single-arm pressing, single-arm rowing, lunges, single-leg deadlifts, hamstring curls are all excellent options for developing some of those weak points. There's in that accessory work manual I mentioned earlier, there's demos for all this stuff and kind of how to periodize it. But to give you some examples of that, right? So in the upper body specifically, we'll see that with a lot of pressing, the pecs and anterior delts will tend to develop quite a bit. And commonly we'll see lifters who tend to, as I mentioned, get kind of into that sort of shrugged up, very internally rotated, imaginary lat syndrome type posture because they're missing some of that internal rotation in their shoulders, right? The first place we want to start would, of course, be at a postural level and just making sure that we're addressing the mobility side of things. But from there, if we know that the pecs and sort of anterior side of the shoulders is very underdeveloped or overdeveloped relative to the back, well, then we'd want to start to work on developing the back of the shoulders and also building in a little bit of rotation capacity. Again, that's going to really help loosen things up. A good rule of thumb for powerlifters is incorporating some level of rotation is going to really help with loosening things up more so than just sort of trying to stretch both sides evenly and not addressing that transverse plane component, right? So in the upper body, as I mentioned, teaching that ability to twist, even using a rotational vector, something like a single arm press where you need to control the torsion as a way of pressing up with one arm, right? Single arm rows do the same thing. You've got an anti-rotation or a rotation exercise, depending on how you perform them, are all going to be great options, right? For the lower body, we want to look at two things, right? So you've got the squat pattern, you've got a hip hinge pattern, effectively your squat and your deadlift, right? And we want to try to train single leg versions of both of those. So Bulgarian split squats, reverse lunges are all good. Even getting into a little bit more on the muscular balance side of things, some pistol squats and deep hip control are all going to be good places to work from. For the hinge side of things, single leg deadlifts are great because they are actually fully unilateral. So they're fully on one leg. You don't have a second leg for support. Single leg dumbbell rows are actually a really good alternative if you struggle with balance on those single leg deadlifts, as they help to kind of teach you that static position in the hip that you want to be at to develop these smaller stabilizers in your hips and your core and your knees and back, right? So any questions so far on this? You can just pop in on the unmute yourselves and pop in on the chat. If this is all making sense, we will keep rolling. All right. So in that case, we'll jump into programming. So programming accessory work is a little bit of an art, and it's very context dependent, right? So first we need to look at how much are we going to do. So relative to the sum of the work we're going to do in our program, if we have 100% of our training program here, what percentage of that volume and workload is going to be represented by accessory work? So as a good rule of thumb, I like to look at where you're at in terms of your progression as a powerlifter, so intermediate, advanced, beginner, right? And also I like to look at where you're at from a muscularity standpoint in the weight class that you're in. So whether you're very lean at the top of your weight class, maybe holding some extra body fat, but at the top of your weight class, looking to cut down, or just sitting at the bottom of a weight class looking to fill out, right? So with that said, we want to look at, if you're newer to lifting, so we'll say the first 2 years or so of training, definitely still able to make fairly linear progression, and you stand to gain a decent amount of muscle at this point. 2 years, nobody's really going to be near their muscular potential. So with that, if we know that you're there, you could probably stand to fill out your weight class a little more. We're looking at probably about 25 to 35% of your overall training volume, and you could just count this by number of sets per week. So if you did 50 sets of exercise per week in your training program, that's pretty normal. We might see 12 to 15 sets in a workout, right? We'd want to see somewhere in the range of about 3 to 5 of those sets per workout be accessory movements, right? Keep in mind, this can be filled in with, you would have your squat movements and your secondary movements and all that as well, but 3 to 5 sets of accessory work as well. That's going to give you some additional volume, help you to gain some extra muscle, as well as building some movement variability and just sort of keeping your movement quality good, right? On the other end of the spectrum, if you've been lifting for quite a while and you're closer to the advanced side of the spectrum, maybe sitting closer to the top end of your weight class, you're not looking to gain a ton. We're probably not going to bias as much volume with this because we're not looking to gain as much muscle. And instead, we're really focused on keeping healthy and trying to apply a fairly high degree of specificity to your training. So keeping specific to your squat, your bench press, and your deadlift, and having a ton of variation isn't going to benefit you as much in terms of gaining strength at that stage in training. So this is like 5+ years of focused, proper powerlifting training and sitting near the top end of your weight class, right? So on something like, in an example like that, we're probably looking at about 15 to 25% of your weekly training volumes being accessory work. So, and then we're looking a little bit closer to about 2 to 4 sets of accessory work per workout, right? Again, everyone's going to have different amounts of volume that they're going to do per session. That's why I went with the percentage-based recommendations as opposed to saying you should do 4 or 5 sets, right? But this gives you a way to scale based on progression. Within those ranges, we got about a 10% range. And that range, where you sit in that range, is going to be really determined by how close you are to competition. So what training phase you're in. So if you're very close to competition, your training is very heavy, you're very close to maxing out, you'd want to err on the lower end of that spectrum. So closer to 15% for advanced trainees, closer to 25% for more beginner to intermediate trainees. And then if you're further away from competition, you're applying less specificity, you have sort of less heavy training going on, and you're generally focusing more on accumulating volume and workload, then going to the higher end of that spectrum might be really beneficial because it's going to let you add some extra volume to your training while managing fatigue and managing injury risk as well. Also, just being further from training, you don't have to worry about being hyper specific with your program. You'll tend to hold on to, I'll restart that sentence. We don't need to worry about being as hyper specific with our training because of the phase of training we're in being less specific in the first place. We don't want to be doing 5 different exercises in addition to our peaking program because we've got so many things going on when we're really trying to focus on developing one trait. Whereas in a hypertrophy phase or volume-based phase, when we're trying to build and be less specific, more accessory work tends to fit in more easily there. Okay. So the last thing I'd mentioned with accessory work and picking volumes that you're working with and how much per workout is auxiliary goals. So we've talked about everything within a really tight powerlifting context. So we're talking about, hey, you know what, I want to get stronger, lift well at meets, and my next competition is X weeks away, right? That's great. But I find most of the lifters that I'll talk with and work with end up having some kind of auxiliary goals, either now or at some point in the future. They'll end up developing some goals where they'll say, hey, you know what, I'm really happy with the progress I'm making with my power lifts, but I would also love to run a 5-minute mile. But I would love to ride a mountain bike a couple days a week. But I want to, you know, get hot and shredded for summer, right? This is where the amount of accessory work we do and really the focus of the overall program starts to shift a little bit. And this is very much on a case-by-case basis. It's hard to assign some percentages to contexts like that just because there's so many variables. But know that realistically, as we start to broaden the goals, we're probably going to see more accessory work and less specific powerlifting work just because our goals have shifted from just powerlifting to powerlifting plus one or two other things that you're working on. As always, there's going to be a compromise there in terms of your overall results in powerlifting, but not uncommon to see it. So I figured it's worth addressing. Okay. So the last couple of things we're going to go through today are basically selecting accessory exercises. So how to identify what you should be doing to tackle certain weak points and, you know, what lifts are going to help with that. And then we're going to talk about progression schemes, which is where I feel most people fall short on developing their accessory program, where they'll just do 3 sets, 8 every week. And, you know, they either progress a bit or they don't progress at all, or they just kind of fart around and they get a little stronger, they get a little weaker, and there's no real plan there like they would have for their regular program. The last thing we'll get into is cycling through lists. And this just factors in a little bit deeper into the progressions that we're going to be looking for periodizing the training. So selecting lifts. When we're looking at our accessory exercises, we want to look at the two things we mentioned at the start of the training. So are we trying to gain muscle with this, or are we trying to promote muscular balance and longevity with this, right? So we'll generally keep things a little bit more on the muscular side of things here, in the sense that when we're trying to develop weak points, that's a good place to start. So some common examples we'll see. Let's say you deadlift and you've tried doing some pause deadlifts and snatch grip deadlifts and pulling from a deficit, but really no matter what you do, you always seem to end up really just rounding over, and you always lose your lats every time you get over 85% in your deadlift. Well, we know that the muscles that are going to hold your spine in more extension are your lats, right? So assuming you're bracing well already and it's just simply a factor of muscular strength, well, we need to address some accessory movements that are going to further develop the lats. So we look at the position you're in, and it's that bent over hip hinged position, and a barbell row would help us to hit the lats and be in that hip hinge position. So we actually have a moderate degree of specificity there. So that's going to be really beneficial, right? Similarly, if we saw your knees coming in on squats, or one knee would come in, or you'd shift over to one side, working with that idea of finding the pattern you're working with, so a squat pattern, and then identifying the range of motion that's being held back, right? So if we're in a squat and every time we squat, we shift over to the right and our right knee falls in, well, we probably want to work on developing our side-to-side control in the squat. So doing something like a single leg split squat with the bar on your backs to mimic the torso position and loading that you would see in your normal squat might be really beneficial. Right now, you're starting to train your left leg and your right leg, and making sure that you've got an even amount of strength, coordination, and proprioception on both sides. Right. Again, these are some examples. There's a lot of different ways to tackle hip shift or rounding over on a deadlift. It really depends. But I want to give you just sort of some basic examples to start with, so you can see the method that we're using to select exercises, which is finding the position you're limited in, looking at the muscles that are going to support you there, and then training those two in tandem with each other. Yeah, the foundation for that's pretty much always going to stay the same. So the nitty-gritty progression schemes. So we'll see quite a lot of progression schemes in powerlifting programs. We'll see linear periodization, undulating periodization, DUP, conjugate style training. There's the list can go on, right? With accessory work, because of the nature of it, I find that getting into heavily undulating work is a strategy that I won't tend to use very often, just because it's just not necessary for most people. By the time you're needing to do that, you're getting very perhaps overly specific for most people. There's some cases where we'd use it, but most of the time, probably a bit much. So with that said, I've actually outlined a progression scheme that you can look at here. So we'll share screen. And this is actually pulled directly from my ebook, the Definitive Powerlifting Accessory Manual, to show you kind of how we would progress things here. So we can look at this as an example of, let's say, a barbell row that you're doing, and you're doing 4 sets of 8 to 12, right? So this is what we call a double progression model. So with this double progression model, we're basically taking the rep range that we're working with for the number of sets we have, and we start with one number of reps kind of near the bottom. We want to select a weight that gives us a little bit of wiggle room there. And then each session that we're training it, we try to add reps to build our total towards the top end. So if you had 4 sets of 8 to 12, we have a range of about 32 up to 48 reps. And the idea being you start at the bottom for your total and then build up over the course of however many weeks it takes you to get, or however many sessions, I should say, to get to the top end of that range. Once you get there, you'd increase the weight 5 to 10% and repeat. So in our example here, we can see, on week 1, we get all our sets at 8 reps, we go 9, and then we start to get into a little bit more challenge, right? We're a little more fatigued around that 3rd set, and then we drop down to 9, right? Next set or next session, we get a little bit more, and incrementally we go up. And you can see the volume in each session is going up and up and up and up until week 9, where we increase that weight about 5% and we restart down to 32 reps. Now, what's really cool about this is it allows for some accumulation and an increase in volume, which is really, really important for hypertrophy and muscle growth. But we've also built in a periodic deload where your volume drops to just shy of 2/3 of what you would be lifting at the peak here. So that's really nice in the sense that we're not just pushing and going all the way up until you rip a bicep. We're actually incorporating a drop where you're allowing for a bit of recovery. And so you can see here, we've got kind of that same idea that happens where things go up and then we add a little bit more weight and we repeat until we get back to that 48, right? So over an 8-week block, your training could look something like this. Again, these loads are arbitrary. These reps are inspired from what I've seen in terms of progressions, but they're not by any means an absolute you must follow these rep counts. Keep in mind, we're following an 8 to 12 scheme here. You could use this for 6 to 10. I like about a 4 rep range just because it makes that 5% to 10% increase in weight a little bit more easy to stomach. When you start working with really tight ranges, for example, 6 to 8 range, for example, where there's 2 reps kind of separating the bottom and the top, making that increase into the next jump can sometimes be a bit premature. Depends on the movement, depends on the lifter, but as a good rule of thumb, I found that 4 or 5 rep spread to be really useful for about a 2-month progression, right? So you can see here, over the course of a couple months, our volumes, our average intensity, our average workload is increasing. We have this little deload, and then we increase to a little bit more here, and we deload, and then we increase to a little bit more. And most training is going to do this to some degree. We're just looking at this from a progressive overload standpoint, where it's not just one straight line up to the top, right? By adding this recovery, we're allowing for some room to recover from any sort of wear and tear in the same way that you'd take a deload periodically in your normal training. So if you want a bit more detail or access to some of the case studies and sample programs in here, again, just comment ebook below. I'll get it sent over. All right, great. So last thing to go through is cycling through lifts. So given that our goal with accessory training is to boost up our main lifts, right? We're trying to get our 1 rep max on the squat, the bench press, and the deadlift higher. You having the highest barbell row in the gym is likely an independent factor, right? As you start to get below about 5 reps, you're going to start training more for a specific strength within the context of an accessory exercise, and you're probably going to see less carryover into your main movements. It's just really been my observation with coaching. We've tried doing heavy sets of 3 and stuff, and they're cool, but I'll tend to see more carryover in that 5+ rep range into your movements when you're trying to develop positional strength or muscularity, or just simply develop muscles for muscular balance as well. So with that said, we're generally going to want to cycle through a few lifts as we go. Good rules of thumb here are making sure that you're not repeating the same accessory movement twice within the same week. So if you're going to do upper back work twice in a week, you might have barbell rows as one day and then dumbbell rows the next, or chest supported dumbbell rows, or a cable row, or something like that. You're still getting the same muscle group, but you're just targeting it with slightly different angles, slightly different loading pattern, and that's just going to prevent you from getting too stale. Typically, training an exercise more than once a week within the context of accessory work, again, we start to see you really prioritize getting really good at a lift where it might not necessarily translate into the best results onto your power lifts, right? So with that said, a really simple progression scheme that we can go through here is just making sure that every couple months you're changing your main movement. So that would look something like this. Again, this is just taken out of that ebook. And so quite simply, we might do, for our row example here, weeks 1 to 8, doing a pendlay row, following that double progression scheme, then going into an underhand grip barbell row, and then a chest supported dumbbell row. What I like about this in terms of a specific program is we're going to work on loading some explosive strength. We're going to work on developing the position of the deadlift a little bit more. And then as we get into some heavier deadlifts, presumably later in the training cycle, we're actually taking some of the load off of the lower back, which is going to allow for a bit more recovery room. Frankly, really heavy deadlifts are going to tax your back a lot. So adding on a ton of extra fatigue from some barbell rows or pendlay rows might not be the best move, given that those peaking phases are typically more challenging. And then from there, you could just restart that cycle and go starting again at week 1 with those pendlays and working through 8 weeks of that to the barbell rows to the chest supported rows. This is an example off a 24-week block, but you could easily do it as 2 exercises that you alternate between as well. Both are fair game. Okay. So that's pretty much it for today. So to reiterate and summarize for our accessory work program, we're going to do accessory work to build muscularity, to build a bigger engine for that faster car, a higher 1 rep max, bigger muscles. Then we're also going to do accessory work for injury prevention and positional strength, making sure that we're managing muscular imbalances and just not overtraining one trait in powerlifting, staying balanced enough where we can get longevity in our powerlifting career. From there, in terms of selecting exercises, we want to typically involve a bit more movement variability. So looking at more single arm and single leg stuff, involving some side to side and rotational components in the lifts, single arm dumbbell presses, lunges, single leg deadlifts. Those are all some great starting points, right? In terms of selecting lifts to address weak points in your main work, look at the position you're in and look at the muscles that are going to support that. So we use that deadlift example of that hip hinge, torso at about 45 degrees and back rounding over, the lats giving way. We'd want to use a barbell row in that example with the torso at about 45 degrees. Periodizing the lifts, I'm a big fan of that double progression scheme outlined in the ebook, just because it's simple, it manages fatigue, and it's really easy to mold to the periodization scheme you're using in your main program for your squat, your bench, and your deadlift. Last thing is make sure that you're not just spending the same or using your time on the same lifts year round. Try to cycle through them every 8 weeks or so to make sure that you're not going to get super stale or overdevelop the skill of the exercise, and you're really getting more of the muscular benefits. As always, if you have any questions, post them down in the comments below. I'm happy to answer them. And if you want, again, a copy of that ebook to have some examples of some case studies and sample programs, as well as a bit more detail on how to select your accessory lifts, comment ebook in the chat or the comments below, and I'll get it sent over your way. Thanks. And we'll call it a day there. Have a great one.